Without further ado, Dr. Mizrahi.
Thank you, Sherry. This is going to be the third and last session of Jewish humor in the traditional sources. The fact that it's the last session doesn't mean that it's the end of the humor. We could have many more sessions and still not see the end of all the humorous passages in our sources. The Midrash, in particular, is a good source of what you might call humor. As I said, not everybody agrees that this or that passage is meant to be humorous, but it's certainly true that it strikes a lot of people that way. So the Midrash has a lot of very colorful stories, stories that you remember, stories that are made vivid in the telling and in the imagery. For example, the Hebrew letters have a mind of their own. They go around, they fly around, they do things. Let's take an example. At the beginning of Genesis, God renames Abraham and Sarah. To Abraham, he adds a he, the holy he, part of the Tetragrammaton, God's name, and he becomes Avraham. Instead of Avram, he becomes Avraham, which means father of nations. And Sarai, his wife, is renamed Sarah by adding a he, but removing the yod at the end of her name. Sarai Yid, there's a yod at the end, God removes it. And then much later, in the time of Joshua, his original name was Hoshea. And so God renames him Yehoshua. He adds a yod at the beginning of his name. Okay, that's what we know from the Torah. Now, what does the Midrash say? Midrash says, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a mystic of the first century, said, the yods that God took from Sarai flew and posted itself in front of the throne of the Holy One, blessed be he, and said, Master of the universe, because I'm the smallest letter, you took me out of the name of Sarai the righteous? In other words, the yod was incensed that God should take him out of the name of Sarai, who's a righteous woman. So what does God do? Several centuries later, he puts that same yod at the beginning of Joshua's name. It's the same one. Much later, King David comes on the scene. And the Talmud says, King David pleaded before God, sovereign of the universe, who can understand his own errors? I know I have many sins. But God tells him, your sins are forgiven you. David implored, may my sin, the incident of Bathsheba, not be recorded in the Torah. That's when he sent Bathsheba's husband to the front line to be killed so that he could marry his wife Bathsheba. God said, that is impossible. If the single letter yods I removed from Sarai continuously protested for many years until Joshua came and I added it to his name, how much more so a complete section of the Bible? Okay, that's what we have in the sources. Now, when something is in the Midrash, it means one of two things. Either it's meant as factual, this is what happened, this is what our tradition is, it's been passed from one generation to the next, through the centuries, or it's a made-up story that's meant to teach us something. In this particular case, it's hard to believe that it's meant as factual. Letters don't have minds of their own. So there are lessons there. Let me give you a chance to chime in. What do you think the lessons are in this story? I myself can think of 3 of them, but maybe you have other ideas. Go ahead. Anybody? What is this teaching us?
The first thing comes to my mind is the importance of names, but that is
certainly true. That is
general.
Absolutely true. It's very, very central in Judaism. Your name is your essence. Your name is who you are.
And then after creation, everything was named. So that's not what you're looking for, though.
my 3 lessons are different, but this is certainly a valid one. Anybody else? Okay, let me tell you what I think. The first lesson I get from this is that nothing is wasted in the world. Everything is recycled, even a letter. The sages of the Talmud often tell us that some latter-day biblical characters were the same as earlier ones in the Torah. They don't give a strong reason for that, except to say that the first one is well known and the second one was not completely introduced, so we don't know much about the second one, and so they needed to say that it's the same. They say that Keturah, Abraham's second wife, was Hagar, the maid from whom he had Ishmael. They say that Melchizedek, the righteous king, was Shem, the son of Noah, progenitor of the Semites. They say that Jacob's wife was Dinah, one of Jacob's daughters, etc. Now, I resonate to the notion that nothing is wasted in the world. As a physicist, I can tell you that there are lots of conservation laws in the universe. Nature is not wasteful. Nature is stingy, uses the minimum necessary to accomplish something, and nature is not wasteful. In fact, that's the source for my own belief in an afterlife. Is nature, is God going to waste a mind and all that it implies, an entire life, to be that it's going to go completely into oblivion? I don't think so. So I think that there is some kind of an afterlife because nature is not wasteful. You've heard the slogan, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. And I think that God and nature are very much telling us the same thing. So nothing is wasted. The second lesson I get is that all significant events must be recorded for posterity. Full transparency, warts and all. People must be shown as they are. King David wanted God to remove the episode of Bathsheba from the Bible. And God said, no, can't do that. Can't do that. Everything that's significant must be recorded. And that's why all the biblical characters are flawed. All the biblical characters have sins and warts and imperfections and conflict and all that. And God decreed people must be shown as they are. And that's the lesson we infer. The third lesson I infer from this story is that everything is connected to everything else. This letter Yod connects Sarah, Joshua, and David. Okay, and that attests to the fact that God is one. The sages always try to bring very dissimilar things and show that they're really the same thing, or they have a common origin. This is a very strong Jewish trait. Hashem Echad, God is one. And so they connect things that at first blush you would not connect. So the 3 lessons I take from the story of the letter Yod is nothing is wasted, everything is connected to everything else, and all significant events must be recorded for posterity. Any questions or comments before I go on? Okay, let's proceed. Another theme that recurs often, and I mentioned it the last 2 times as well, is the Jewish chutzpah in its feisty relationship with God. And a specialist in this department was Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev. He was a great 18th century Hasidic sage who is always quoted, his stories, his dictums, his philosophy of life. He was extremely well liked and followed. Now, these are 2 things that he says, and they both involve God, of course. Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev stood before the congregation on Rosh Hashanah and said, Master of the universe, you commanded us not to write on the holy days except to save a life. You're not allowed to write on a holiday or on Shabbat. You are also bound by your own law. Therefore, you may not inscribe us in the book of death on this day. You may only inscribe us in the book of life. So he's telling God, you have no choice on Rosh Hashanah. If you want to write something, you have to write us in the book of life to save our lives. You cannot inscribe it in the book of death because that would result in death, and you're not allowed to do that on a holiday. Smart arguments. Another one. On Yom Kippur Eve, Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev asked an illiterate tailor, since you couldn't read the prayers today, you're illiterate, what did you say to God? The tailor said, I said, dear God, you want me to repent of my sins, but my sins have been so small. I confess, there have been times when I failed to return to the customers the pieces of leftover cloth. And when I couldn't help it, I even ate non-kosher foods. But really, is that so terrible? Now take yourself, God, examine your own sins. You have robbed mothers of their babies and have made orphans of helpless babies. Your sins are much more serious than mine. I'll tell you what, God, let's make a deal. You forgive me and I'll forgive you. Ah, you foolish man, cried Rabbi Yitzhak. You had God on the ropes and let him off easily. Just think, you could have asked God to redeem the entire Jewish people, not just yourself. That's how Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev related to God. Very Jewish way. Okay. Any questions or comments on this this portion? No? Okay. Let's press on. As I promised last week, the next section.
Wait a minute, I think somebody wanted to say something but was muted. Did anybody want to say something?
Anybody? Okay. As I promised last week, I'm gonna engage now in a dangerous section that I call not for ladies. I hope that the ladies here will forgive me. And as I said, the rabbis were always very open on matters of sex and bathroom. The Talmud is full of them, the Midrash is full of them, and nothing it was beyond comments. Comment with the purpose of learning something, not just gratuitous, perhaps. Okay, Rabbi Akiva said, that's in Tractate Berachot. Once I secretly followed Rabbi Yehoshua to a bathroom. He wanted to know what you're supposed to do in a bathroom. What does the Torah say? How does the Torah say you're supposed to behave? And rather than ask the question, he wanted to witness for himself. Ben Azai said to him, did you dare to take such liberties with our master? He replied, it's a matter of Torah and I have to learn it. Another one, Rav Kahana once hid on the Rav's bed to find out what you're supposed to do with your wife when you're secluded with her. He heard him chatting with his wife, joking with her, and then doing what he needed to do. In other words, have intercourse. Rabbi Kahana whispered to himself, you would think my master has never eaten this dish before. In other words, he's very involved in what he's doing. Rav heard him and said to him, Kahana, are you here? Get out because it's rude. He replied, it's a matter of Torah and I have to learn. So the students felt that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So rather than ask for the details, they just wanted to witness. Okay, now our rabbis taught, this is from Tractate Shabbat. Our rabbis taught, who's wealthy? Rabbi Meir said, he who takes pleasure in his wealth. Rabbi Tarfon said, he who possesses 100 vineyards, 100 fields, and 100 slaves working in them. Rabbi Akiva said, he who has a beautiful and virtuous wife is wealthy. Rabbi Yosei said, he who has an indoor restroom near his dining table. So, he is very practical. In those days, it was rare to have indoor plumbing. And he said, he who has that is wealthy. This one is very crude. The Moabite had a god called Baal Peor, who was worshipped by relieving yourself on the idol. I don't claim to understand the depths of the human mind, but that's how a certain group worshipped their idols. the Talmud asked, if a Jew does it on the idol, intending it as a gesture of contempt, is he guilty of idolatry? And they answered yes. They said it is idolatry because that's the way this particular idol is worshipped. I have more, but I'll spare you the rest. The limits of politeness. The Talmud says that you have to be very polite and courteous in all your dealings with other people. It's very important, and it quotes a lot of inspirational stories about the importance of politeness. But there is one exception. Rabbi Nachman said in Tractate Megillah, all foul language is forbidden, except when directed at idolatry, in which case it is permitted. Rabbi Huna said, a Jew is permitted to tell an idolater, take your idol and stick it up your, well, I'm not going to complete the quotes because there are ladies present, but it is spelled out in full in the Talmud. So you have to be polite, but when you confront idolatry, that's the big bugaboo. You can throw politeness to the four winds. Then there are stories of the rabbi discussing the beauty of women in their history. The rabbis taught, Tractate Megillah again, there have been 4 women of exceptional beauty in the world: Sarah, Rahav, Abigail, and Esther. Rabbi Joshua ben Kocha said, actually, I heard that Esther was sallow, even though she was endowed with great charm. In that case, they said, Vashti should replace Esther in the lists. Okay, they had to compromise. The rabbis thought Rahav inspired lust by her name alone. Whoever says Rahav, Rahav has an immediate orgasm. Rabbi Nachman said to him, I say Rahav, Rahav, and nothing happens to me. Rabbi Isaac replied, I was speaking of someone who really knows her and is intimate with her. But elsewhere, the Talmud says that Eve was more beautiful than Sarah. Tosafot said she's not on the list because only daughters of human beings are mentioned. Okay, so you have these men talking about the beauty of women. What is the lesson here? What do you think the lesson is? If it's there, there must be a lesson. What are we taught? Anybody? No? Okay, I think that what's taught is that it's okay for men to talk like that. Nothing is being hurt. I'm sure that women also talk about cute men. And so it's saying if you want to talk like that, that's fine. You didn't insult anybody. And you're just talking about girls.
But I think the troubling part to me, Maurice, and you know I feel this way, is that it's a boys' club here. I mean, there's nothing talking about what women think or what women said. It's all about what men think and what men said, and it's troubling to me.
Right. But anyway, that's the only lesson I can think of why this is included, and that's the lesson in another section of the Talmud. In Tractate Bava Metzia, the rabbis are comparing the size of the reproductive organs. Believe it or not. They say, well, never mind what they said. They are comparing the size of the reproductive organ. Why? Again, if men want to talk about that, that's fine. There's nothing that the Torah can say that is wrong with it. Okay, so they do. What can you think about it? What can you think would be wrong with it? And so simply by reporting the story, they're telling us if men want to talk about the beauty of women or the size of the reproductive organs, that's okay. Because there's no word of blame.
And in those times, I mean, we don't want to be anachronistic. In those times, maybe that was what was done commonly. We're looking at it from a 21st century point of view, or are we?
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely. But, you know, if it's reported without comment, it means that there's nothing wrong with this kind of conversation. Another thing, the rabbis were very conscious of physical beauty, especially their own. In Tractate Berachot, it says, Rabbi Yochanan said, I'm the only one remaining of Jerusalem's men of beauty, outstanding beauty. But that is not so, for did not the master say, Rabbi Kahana's beauty is a reflection of Rabbi Abahu's beauty, and Rabbi Abahu's beauty is a reflection of forefather Jacob's beauty, etc., etc. Rabbi Yochanan used to go and sit at the gates of the mikvah. He said, when the daughters of Israel come out of the bath, let them look at me, that they may bear sons as beautiful and as learned as I am. Okay? The rabbi said to him, don't you fear the evil eye by talking like that? He replied, oh, I'm of the seed of Joseph, and the evil eye is powerless against the seed of Joseph. Rabbi Elazar fell ill, and Rabbi Yochanan, the beautiful one, went in to visit him. He noticed that Rabbi Elazar was weeping, and he said to him, why do you weep? He replied, I'm weeping on account of this beauty of yours that's going to rot in the earth. He said to him, on this account, you surely have a reason to weep. And he wept with him. Okay, now when are you supposed to get married? Our rabbi starts.
Wait, you have a comment. You have a comment, Maurice.
Go ahead.
In which part of the Bible is it said, haughtiness cometh before the fall, and false pride before destruction? So a rabbi proclaiming that my member is the most beautiful is almost idolatrous, since the image of the penis was in fact an idol for the Phoenicians. And to me, this talk doesn't sound proper for men who were learned. Comment?
Okay, that's the thought. But beauty in all its forms is always praised in the Talmud and the Midrash. And you can say that since we're created in God's image, by praising any part of our bodies, we're praising God indirectly.
But I also think you're bringing this up because these struck you as funny. That's why you're talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Okay, when to marry? Our rabbis taught a man should first study the Torah and then marry. But if he can't live without a wife, he should first marry and study Torah. A student came before Rabbi Huna bareheaded. The rabbi asked, why don't you have head covering? He replied, because I'm not married. Rabbi Huna then turned his face away from him and said, do not appear before me again until you're married. He who is 20 and unmarried spends all his days in sinful thoughts. The school of Rabbi Ishmael taught likewise. Until the age of 20, the Holy One, blessed be he, sits and waits. When will he take a wife? As soon as one becomes 20, if he still is not married, God exclaimed, may he be blasted. Rabbi Hista said, the reason I'm superior to my colleagues is that I married as I was entirely free for study. And if I had married at 14, I would have said to Satan, I defy you. You can't tempt me. Rava said to Rabbi Nathan Ben Ammi, while you still have some authority on your son, marry him off. So early marriage was important for that reason. Let me see. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was engaged in preparing for the marriage of his son into the family of Rabbi Yosei ben Zimra. It was agreed that his son should first spend 12 years studying in the academy, that's a long time, and then marry. When the girl was led before the son and he saw her for the first time and saw how beautiful she was, he said to them, can we just make it 6 years? When they made the girl pass before him a second time, he said, actually, I'd rather marry her first and then go to the academy. He felt ashamed by his fickleness, but his father said to him, my son, you have the mind in the creator of your creator. In the Torah, God first says, you bring them in and plant them, but then later God says, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. In other words, God first told the Israelites to build the sanctuary after they settled in the promised lands, but then he ordered them to build it while they were still in the wilderness, so he could be with them even sooner. And lots of midrashim describe the covenants between us and God as a husband and wife thing. We are marrying God at Mount Sinai, and he vows never to divorce us in the covenants. Let's see. Now, the rabbis were not above playing up to prejudices for a good cause. In Tractate Nida, they said, it's within the power of men to increase the number of their sons. Of course, I don't have to tell you that in those days, sons were valued a lot more than daughters, even though you need an equal number to have a good society. If they restrain themselves during intercourse to allow their wives to have an orgasm first, their children shall be males and they will acquire great merits. Okay? Rabbi Katsina says, and again, bragging, I could make all my children be males. Rava said, one who wishes all his children to be males should have intercourse twice in succession, because the second time he's better able to restrain himself. So, what are they doing here? Surely they know this was not true. I mean, they had a lot of experimental evidence that this was not true. But nevertheless, they taught the people that by playing up to their prejudices for a good cause. The good cause is be mindful of your wife and make sure she's satisfied. And so they play up to their prejudices. If you do that, you'll have male children. So they intentionally misled the people for a good cause. Okay. Let me know if I'm going too far, okay? There are puritanical versus anti-puritanical streaks in the Talmuds. Now, I must say that most contemporary commentators, medieval contemporary commentators, very little of that is in it, because they were influenced by the society around them. Even if you live in an isolated society surrounded by high walls, you can't help being influenced by the society around you. Now, most of these people lived in Christian lands where these matters were muted. You just don't talk about these things. And they were influenced by that. In Talmudic days, it was the opposite. You can talk about anything, especially if it enhances your understanding of Torah. Now, okay, in Tractate Nedarim, Rabbi Yochanan ben Habbai said, the ministering angels told me 4 things. People are born lame because their parents practiced anal intercourse. People are born dumb because they kiss that place, practice oral intercourse. Deaf because they talk while having intercourse. And blind because they look at that place. Rabbi Yochanan said, this is your opinion. But our sages said, the law is not according to you. A man may do whatever he wants with his wife with her consent. So the rabbis refused to be browbeaten by terrible consequences and by appeal to high authorities, the ministering angels. The rebuke here is particularly strong. The bottom line is that Judaism has nothing to say about what you do in the privacy of your bedroom with your spouse, but has plenty to say about when you do it and who you do it with. That's the division. Now here's one about manners in Tractate Nida. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, again the 1st century mystic, said there are 4 things that the Holy One, blessed be he, hates. And I too dislike them. I love this way of phrasing it. So the rabbis say, I agree with God, but I'm not going as far as God is going. God hates these things, but I only dislike them. So he's telling God, you have the right general idea, but let's not go overboard. Okay, so one of these things is that you must not have sexual intercourse in the presence of any living creatures. Rabbi ben Rav Huna used to chase away the wasps from his curtained beds. Abaye drove away the flies, and Rabbi chased away the mosquitoes. No witnesses, including insects. Okay, again, this very short quote symbolizes how the rabbi thought about things. They talk about the pleasures in the world to come, that is, in the afterlife. And they said in Tractate Berachot, some things in this world hint at pleasures in the world to come. In other words, these are the best things in this world. Shabbat, sunshine, sex, and going to the bathroom. These are the top four that you enjoy in this world, according to the rabbis. Again, very clear. Also, in Tractate Pesachim, it says, when a divorced man marries a divorced woman, 4 people go to bed. In other words, like it or not, comparisons will be made. And then there's talk about women being jealous of each other and being mad at some other woman trying to steal their husbands. Here's a story from Tractate Ketubot. Homa, Abaye's wife, came to Rava after the death of Abaye, her third husband, and asked him, give me an allowance for food. He did so. Give me an allowance for wine. He said to her, I know that your husband, the great Abaye, did not drink wine, so you probably didn't have it in the house. Why should I give you an allowance for it? She replied, by the life of the master, he gave me to drink 4 cups from cups as long as this. And she showed him her bare arm. She showed him her bare arm, and she was very beautiful. Rava got up, interrupted the proceedings, went home, and had intercourse with his wife. His wife asked, who was at court today? He replied, Homa, the late Abaye's wife. Thereupon his wife followed Homa, striking her with leather straps, and drove her out of the town of Mahuza. She said to her, you have already killed 3 men, your previous husbands who died, and now you come to kill another man, my husbands? Okay, so this tells us that nothing has changed in the world. We're still the same people. I'm going to skip this one. Let me see now. Okay. Tell me what you think the teaching is in this story from Tractate Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Yaakov was suffering from a slit in the rear ends. And Rabbi Ami, some say Rabbi Asi, directed him to take 7 grains of purple-colored alkali, wrap them in the collar of his shirts, tie it around a white thread of cattle hair, dip it in white naphtha and burn it, and apply the ashes to the sore. While preparing this, he was to take the kernel of a bramble nut and apply its split side to the slits. That is, if there is a slit externally. But what to do if it's internal? One should take some fat of a goat that has not borne any young, melt it and apply it. Or one should take 3 melon leaves which have faded in the shade, burn them and apply the ashes. In the absence of these, let one apply snail shells, or else take olive mixed oil with wax and let them be covered with a rag of linen in the summer and cotton wool in the winter. That's the old wives' tale. That's the remedy. Why do you think that story is there?
Because by the time you find all that crap, the pain goes away.
Exactly. Very good. It keeps your mind off of your problem. Go do all these little things, and by that time you'll have forgotten what it is that troubles you. Now, the Talmud is full of these so-called remedies. There's lots and lots of them. Now, but the Talmud is Jewish law. Should we follow these remedies today? Now go ask some ultra-Orthodox Jews. What do you think they say? Very clever. What do you think they say? When they said, do you do this when you have these ailments? That's in the Talmud. What do you think they say? Any guess?
They won't do it on Shabbat. No carrying. I don't know. I'm just kidding.
I'll tell you what they did. They may be ultra-Orthodox, and you may think of them what you will, but they're not crazy. So what did they say? They say, back in those days, the human anatomy was different. Today, 2,000 years later, the human anatomy has changed. So while these remedies may have worked back then, they don't work today. And so they go to a doctor who applies modern medicine to whatever ails them. So they're not crazy.
So it's okay to, so it's okay to say humanity has changed, but not to say the sources
Exactly.
needed to change.
Back then, all this worked. That's a very clever answer. I'm not sure they believe that the human anatomy has changed, and certainly we have no evidence of that. Evolution goes much more slowly than that, but that's what they say. And it keeps their mind at ease, and they can go to the doctor who will prescribe modern remedies to their ailments. Okay, now, if you think Conan Doyle invented Sherlock Holmes, think again. Sherlock Holmes was invented in the Midrash. Here's a story. An Athenian bought a Jewish slave who was blind in one eye. A Jewish slave was bound in one eye. The seller said to him, "He may be half blind, but he's very wise and can see far away with his one good eye." When they came out of the gates, the slave said to him, "Let's hurry so we can overtake the caravan in front of us and join it." The master did not see any caravan and asked, "Is there then a caravan in front of us?" "Yes, and a female camel is in front of us. She is blind in one eye. She has twins in her womb and is carrying 2 skin bottles, one containing wine and the other containing vinegar. She is 4 miles away, and the camel driver is a Gentile." The master said to the slave, "Oh, you who belongs to a stiff-necked people, you are blind in one eye yourself. So how do you know the camel is blind in one eye?" "I noticed that one side of the path has been grazed by the camel, but not the other." "And how do you know there are twins in her womb?" "She lay down and I noticed the depression on the ground that there are 2 of them." "And how do you know she's carrying 2 skin bottles, one containing wine and the other vinegars?" He answered, "From the drippings. Wine is absorbed into the ground, but vinegar leaves bubbles." "And how do you know that the camel driver is a Gentile?" He replies, "Because I can tell that he urinated in the middle of the road. A Jew would never do that, but rather move to a corner." "And how do you know that the caravan is 4 miles away?" "The mark of the camel's hoof is perceptible up to 4 miles, but not beyond." So, that's the story of the Jewish Sherlock Holmes. And that's the prime reason for anti-Semitism. The envy of Jews who are viewed as smart and successful. The Gentile owner of the slave was jealous of his slave because he was so smart, even with one eye. This one is one of my favorites from the book of Jewish humor. It's not in the Talmud itself, but it's about the Talmud and the Talmudic mind. I love it. Here it is. After months of negotiation with the authorities, a Talmudist from Odessa was granted permission to visit Moscow. He boarded the train and found an empty seat. At the next stop, a young man got on and sat next to him. The scholar looked at the young man and thought, this fellow doesn't look like a peasant. And if he isn't a peasant, he probably comes from this district. If he comes from this district, then he must be Jewish, because this is, after all, a largely Jewish district. On the other hand, if he's a Jew, where could he be going? I'm the only Jew in our district who has permission to travel to Moscow. Ah, but just outside Moscow, there is a little village called Samvet, and Jews don't need special permission to go there. But why would he be going to Samvet? He's probably going to visit one of the Jewish families there. But how many Jewish families are there in Samvet? Only two, the Bernsteins and the Steinbergs. The Bernsteins are up in years, so a nice-looking young fellow like him must be visiting the Steinbergs. But why is he going? The Steinbergs have only daughters, so maybe he's their son-in-law. Then which daughter did he marry? They say that Sarah married a nice lawyer from Budapest, and Esther married a businessman from Zhytomyr. So it must be Sarah's husband, which means that his name is Alexander Cohen, if I'm not mistaken. But if he comes from Budapest, with all the anti-Semitism they have there, he must have changed his name. What's the Hungarian equivalent of Cohen? Kovacs. But if they allowed him to change his name, he must have some special status. What could it be? Ah, a doctorate from the university. At this point, the Talmudist turns to the young man and says, "How do you do, Dr. Kovacs?" The startled passenger answered, "Very well, thank you, sir, but how do you know my name?" And the Talmudist replies, "Oh, it was obvious." Okay, that's the Talmudic mind. Reminds you of the story of the slave, Jewish Sherlock Holmes. Now, Judaism has built-in checks and balances. For example, in Tractate Sanhedrin, it says, the king and the high priest may not be members of the Sanhedrin's board for deciding when to add a month to the year. Back then, the Sanhedrin, which ruled all Jewish life, appointed a board to decide whether they should add a year, a leap year, to the calendar. Because at that time, they didn't have the permanent calendar we have today. That came only in the 5th century. So they had to decide whether to add a year to the year that was coming. And they said the king and the high priest may not be members of that board. The king on the account of the upkeep of the army, and the high priest because of the codes. What does that mean? It means that the king is going to be biased in favor of adding a month because he pays his soldiers by the year. So adding a month makes the year longer, 13 months, and so the king would be automatically in favor of adding a month. Conflict of interest. The high priest, on the other hand, is biased against adding a month because he has to immerse 5 times without clothes in the mikvah on Yom Kippur. And if Yom Kippur falls a month later, the water is colder and he won't like it. So he is biased in favor of, he's biased against adding a month. So these are very human considerations. Checks and balances. Even the king and the high priest are not allowed to be members of this particular board because of conflict of interests. Let me stop here and ask, do you have any questions or comments before I go on? Anything? Okay. Now, when you wish to take a Nazirite vow, which was rather popular, allowed by the Torah, and disliked by the rabbis, people took vows to kick a bad habit, for example, when they make the vow in public. It's an added incentive to kick a bad habit or acquire a good one. And a vow must be fulfilled. If you want to be freed from your vow, you had to go through a panel of 3 wise men or a wise rabbi to free you of your vow if there was an impropriety, a loophole that makes the vow invalid. Okay. Now, and when you take a Nazirite vow, after your vow expires, you have to bring a sin offering. Now, the Talmud, Untitled Nedarim, mentioned that some people who did not commit any sins wanted an opportunity to bring the sin offering because it's one of the commandments. So they took a Nazirite vow just for the purpose of being allowed to bring a sin offering afterwards, even though they didn't do any sins. Now that's high fervor, but that's what many of them did. Now let's briefly touch on dreams. There's a lot of talk about dreams in Tractate Berachot in the Talmud. An interesting teaching about dreams is all dreams follow their interpretations. What does that mean? It means that they believe that what is suggested in the interpretation of a dream is what will actually happen. If somebody or yourself say, my dream means this, then it will mean that in reality. Autosuggestion, psychological influence, mind over matter, it implies that the dreamer is so profoundly shaken by the alleged meaning of his dream that somehow he makes it happen. Okay. In Berachot, it says, Rabbi Bana'a said there were 24 interpreters of dream in Jerusalem. I had a dream once, and I went around to all of them. And all 24 gave me different interpretations. And all the interpretations were fulfilled. This confirms what the sages said, all dreams follow their interpretation. Another story. The Chaldean, non-Jewish, Bar-Hedia was an interpreter of dream. He used to give a favorable interpretation to those who paid him and an unfavorable interpretation to those who did not pay him. Okay, Abaye and Rava, 2 great rabbis, each had a dream and went to him. Abaye gave him a zuz, but Rava did not give him anything. So to Abaye he gave many good interpretations and to Rava many bad ones. One day Rava learned the teaching, all dreams follow their interpretation. He understood that the interpreter was making these bad things happen to him by simply saying them, and exclaimed, "You wretch, it all depended on you and you gave me all this pain. May it be God's will that you be delivered up to the governments and that they have no mercy on you." So they believe that whatever you say the dream means is what's going to happen. Therefore, the sages took pain to provide good interpretations to the dreams of the people. And even when the people dreamed that they committed terrible crimes, the sages found ways to make it look good. For example, this is a very, very surprising Talmudic passage. If one dreams that he has intercourse with his mother, he can expect understanding, since it says in the book of Proverbs, "You will call understanding mother." If one dreams he has an intercourse with a woman who's engaged, which is not allowed, he can expect knowledge of the Torah, because it says in Deuteronomy, "Torah tzivalanu Moshe morasha kehilat Yaakov." Moses commanded us the Torah, an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. Morasha means inheritance, but can also be read me'orasa, which means engaged. If one dreams he has intercourse with his sister, he can expect wisdom, because it says in Proverbs, "Say to wisdom, you are my sister." If one dreams he has intercourse with a married woman he does not know, he can be confident he is destined for the world to come. What's surprising here is there's not even a hint of a rebuke, because none of this actually happened. No one did anything wrong. No one planned anything wrong. No one even thought anything wrong. And you're not responsible for your doings. So the rabbis always looked for ways, positive ways to interpret your dreams, even if they mention terrible things. And Aaron was known as a pursuer of peace, Rodev Shalom. He was a lover of peace, and he was not above lying to achieve peace. That's the interesting part. The Talmuds, or rather the Torah, tells us many times you're not supposed to say lies. But nevertheless, there are many exceptions to that rule. You're allowed to lie for the sake of peace. You're allowed to lie for protection from loss or harm. You're allowed to lie, of course, to save lives. You're allowed to lie for humility, modesty, and to spare others. So, what did Aaron do? Quote, when two people had a dispute, Aaron went and sat near one of them and said to him, my son, see what your friend is doing. He's beating his heart and tearing his clothes, saying, woe is me. How can I lift up my eyes and look at my friends? I'm ashamed of myself since I was the one who offended him. Aaron would sit with him until he removed the hatred from his heart. Aaron would then go and sit next to the other one and say to him, my son, see what your friend is doing. He's beating his heart and tearing his clothing, saying, woe is me. How can I lift up my eyes and look at my friends? I'm ashamed of myself since I was the one who offended him. Aaron would sit with him until he removed the hatred from his heart. When the two men met, they would hug and kiss each other. So, you're allowed to lie, as Aaron did, to keep the peace between people. Let me stop here and allow a few minutes for discussion. Let me conclude with this story from a major contemporary rabbi, Aryeh Kaplan, who was once asked if there are any jokes in the Talmud. His reply was, yes, there are, but they're all odes. Okay, what do you say now? I'm done.
I'm not sure I understand what Rabbi Kaplan meant by that.
They're always 2,000 years old.
Yeah, right, but
no joke, nothing else.
okay.
That's all. I hope I didn't offend anybody, but I wanted to show you exactly what our sources say.
I was just going to say, sometimes I wonder, did these rabbis not have anything better to do, that they thought of these in I'll say inane or insane circumstances for things to happen or not happen? I mean, or go ahead.
I'm glad you said that. A lot of people say that. These guys had time on their hand, didn't they? The reality is that the Talmud gives us the profession of all these rabbis. All of them had ordinary profession. The great Hillel was a well digger. The great Shammai was a builder of houses. There were wasters. Some were merchants in oil. Some were bakers. Every single one of them has an ordinary profession. And when they served on the Sanhedrin and made these rulings, they were not paid. And many of them were extremely poor. Rabbi Yehoshua, in particular, one of the luminaries of the Talmud, was a blacksmith who was particularly poor. He was dirt poor. So it's not true that they had time on their hands and they had money, and not at all. If you were rich, we know Elazar ben Azariah or Eliezer, if you were rich, and it's mentioned in the Talmud, but of the 1,000 rabbis mentioned in Talmud, the vast majority had everyday, ordinary professions.
So it is true that interpretation, you get what you pay for.
Certainly, you get enough that the Talmud was considered the rock of Judaism for the past 2,000 years. That's the basis of all Jewish law, of correct interpretations. And if you stay with the Torah itself, without the oral law, which by tradition was also given to Moses, but not written down right away, you get stuck with false interpretations. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It doesn't mean physical retaliation. It means monetary compensation. And the rabbis were very clear about that and made very clever arguments saying that that's what it meant. And sure enough, the Jewish record has no instance of anybody saying, oh, you put out my eye, I'm going to put out your eye. There's no such thing. Although Gentiles frequently believe that that's what we do. That's what they do, but that's not what we do. It only means financial compensation. Go ahead.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. And the other thing about an eye for an eye, Dad said to me many years ago, is it means that the punishment will be no more. It's the crime.
Exactly.
Okay. There's no such thing. No more than that.
Exactly. No more than the
And I
value of
guess
an eye for the loss of an eye. Absolutely.
Yeah. Can I ask another question about these great rabbis?
Go ahead, but you're coming in and out. You're coming in and out.
Oh gosh, I thought I was okay. I thought I had fixed the modem.
I hear
All right,
you.
I'm not sure how to fix it. Okay. In those days, the rabbis then, the great sages we read about, like Rashi, had day jobs. They all had stuff that they did, and yet they also usually had classes where students would come and be taught by them. How the heck, you know, what? How the heck did they have any idea how they would fit all this in? They have a day job, they're teaching, they're going to shul. I mean, to me, that's just an amazing day for these people.
They were dedicated. They were dedicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's not even a record of the community helping them. In other words, the community giving them money so they would find the time to do these things. Maybe they did, but it's not mentioned. The only thing that's mentioned is that they had ordinary professions, and the Talmud tells us what these professions were.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Like Rashi was a wine grower. He delivered wine.
Yeah.
They also, my understanding is they would barter. It would be, you didn't necessarily have money, but you promised them, like, let's say, a certain amount of wine when the grapes are done, it was all done, and then I could pay you back with the bread I bought from your bakery and from the butcher I got the meat from and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a bartering, I think, that took place many years ago too.
The great Maimonides and the great Nachmanides were physicians. That's how they made
Yes.
it. When
Right.
I was growing up in Egypt, my rabbi was the chief rabbi of Egypt. And he was a businessman, and he had Gentile partners. And he was doing the job of chief rabbi on the side, in addition to all these other things. In fact, that's the custom in the Sephardic world. The idea of full-time rabbis serving a congregation, that's a very modern thing, and more Ashkenazic than Sephardic.
Right. And we pay them a living wage.
Maurice, why do you think that in the olden times, women were not allowed to attend these classes or participate, and were, I won't say in low esteem, but it wasn't until modern times that women could become cannors, rabbis, great teachers of the Torah and things. Why do you think in ancient times that women weren't allowed to participate, even though they were probably smart and brilliant, and maybe even more so than the men?
Because the men had decided that the job of a woman is the house, the children, and keeping the whole family out of trouble and out of sin. There are instances of women, of course, in the Torah, in the Talmud. There's Beruria, who is extremely learned and has 300 interpretations of the Torah recorded in the Talmud. So there's the prophetess Deborah. There's 7 important prophetesses in the Jewish world. So, but they had to raise themselves against the resistance of all the men around them. Yes, that is true. That is
I think
true.
the men were physically stronger, and that was what gave them that power
Yeah,
for millennia.
absolutely. Can't deny that, even though the Talmud is full of high praise for women. Now, you can interpret the high praise any way you want, but I'd rather the high praise be there than not be there. Anything else? Well, then I hope you learned something and occasionally maybe even smiled when I was telling you all these stories.
Oh, yeah.
And I hope no one was offended by the directness of the stories.
We're all grown-ups. We're all grown-ups.
Yep.
Handle it.
It was
You
terrific.
always give us something
You
to
watch
think
TV
about.
lately, Rabbi, and seen what's on television. I mean, nothing could be offensive anymore. I mean, not Rabbi, but Maurice, but you can't even be offended anymore. What's on TV and in movies and everything. It's like, okay, no biggie.
No, it was fine.
That was fun. It was a
It
good
was
session.
awesome.
Thank you. It was fun.
Let's give Maurice a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maurice. It was really
Thank
great.
you,
It was really
Thank
good.
you all for
Thank
coming.
you. Thank you for having it. Thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Okay, see you next time. Thank y'all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone. You too. Bye-bye.